September 20th, 1944, Lorraine, France. The fog is low, the fields silent. Somewhere ahead, the ground trembles the sound of treads, heavy and slow. German armor, moving through the mist. And then, something impossible. A faint buzzing, like a lawnmower over the battlefield. Soldiers glance up. It isn't a fighter or a bomber, it's too small, too thin, too slow. A Piper Cub, a light, fabric-skinned observation plane, dives straight toward them. But this one is different. Under its fragile wings, 6 tubes jut forward. As it swoops low, white smoke bursts downward, bazookas. A German tank erupts in flame. The Cub streaks away, barely skimming the trees. The pilot? A history teacher from Illinois, Major Charles Carpenter, better known to his men as Bazooka Charlie. Before the world called him Mad Major, Charles Carpenter was just Mr. Carpenter, the history teacher in a small Midwestern high school. He loved telling stories about Gettysburg, Hannibal, Napoleon wars of strategy and guts. But when the Second World War came, Carpenter felt teaching about history wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to make it. So, in 1942, he left the classroom, traded chalk for wings, and joined the U.S. Army Air Forces. He wasn't the type to seek fame. He was a quiet man, thoughtful, analytical. His students remembered him as patient, the kind who saw potential in everyone. But war has a way of reshaping patience into restlessness. By 1944, Carpenter was assigned to the 4th Armored Division, the famed spearhead of General Patton's Third Army. His role, L-4 liaison pilot, flying tiny Piper Cubs, nicknamed Grasshoppers. These weren't warplanes. They were scouts, unarmed, made of metal tubes and fabric, powered by a 65-horsepower engine. Their mission was to spot enemy armor and artillery positions, then relay coordinates for the big guns below. It was dangerous work. They flew low, often just a few hundred feet off the ground, slow enough that even rifle fire could bring them down. But for Carpenter, it wasn't enough. He could see the battlefield, every tank, every movement, but he couldn't do anything about it. He could only watch, and watching men die below while he circled helplessly above began to eat at him. One afternoon, while refueling near the front, he looked at his Piper Cub, its gentle yellow skin, its fragile frame, and said to a mechanic, "If only this little bird could bite." That was the spark. A thought so absurd that at first even his comrades laughed. But Carpenter wasn't joking. He began tinkering, and soon the schoolteacher from Illinois would turn the most harmless aircraft in the U.S. Army into a weapon that terrified the Wehrmacht. It started with frustration. By late 1944, Carpenter had flown hundreds of hours over the European front. He'd seen things most men never lived to describe: columns of German armor crawling through French villages, artillery strikes lighting up the horizon like a storm. And every time he spotted an enemy target, he'd radio coordinates, then wait. Minutes could pass, sometimes hours, before shells landed. By then, the tanks had moved, the infantry had dispersed, or American lives had already been lost. Carpenter hated it. He was the kind of man who believed in doing, not waiting. So he started thinking like a history teacher again, but one teaching the oldest lesson of war: improvise or die. The Piper L-4 Grasshopper had no guns, no armor, and a top speed barely reaching 85 miles per hour. But Carpenter realized it did have one advantage: it could fly almost anywhere, land almost anywhere, and dive silently out of the sky. He began to imagine something radical. What if, instead of just spotting targets, his little cub attacked them? At first, the idea sounded insane. When he pitched it to fellow pilots and mechanics, they burst out laughing. "You want to put bazookas on a cub, Charlie? That thing can barely carry your lunch." But Carpenter just smiled. He'd taught teenagers for 10 years. He knew how to handle laughter. He scavenged parts, experimented with mounting points, and studied the balance of the aircraft. On the underside of each wing strut, he clamped 3 M1A, 1 bazooka launchers, 6 total. The contraption looked ridiculous, like a toy plane covered in plumbing pipes. But when he taxied out onto the grass and opened the throttle, it lifted. And when he pressed the trigger switch he'd wired into his cockpit, the tubes roared a flash of smoke and fire, and rockets streaked away into the open field. It worked. He'd turned the Piper Cub into a rocket-armed attack plane, a Grasshopper with fangs. He named her Rosie the Rocketer. The name was both a wink and a warning, inspired by Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of American ingenuity. At first, his commanding officers were skeptical. Officially, Carpenter's mission was reconnaissance. Unofficially, he'd just built a flying death trap. But results speak louder than regulations, and when the first reports came back that this mad schoolteacher had scored direct hits on German vehicles, the laughter stopped. He'd just changed the rules of aerial warfare, and the world was about to find out what a Piper Cub could really do. September 20th, 1944, the French countryside of Lorraine is soaked in fog. American troops of the 4th Armored Division brace for what they believe will be a small German counterattack. They were wrong. From the mist, the 5th Panzer Army emerged over 200 tanks, including the dreaded Panthers and Tiger I's, engines rumbling like thunder. It was one of the largest armored clashes the U.S. would ever face in Western Europe. And in the middle of it all, circling just above the treetops, was a Piper Cub named Rosie the Rocketer. Carpenter had been scouting for enemy armor when he saw the German column moving along a hedgerow road. His radio crackled with confusion from the ground. Artillery was out of range. Tank destroyers were repositioning. If the Germans broke through, they'd cut the entire flank in two. So Carpenter did what no one expected. He banked hard, dropped altitude, and lined up his target. Imagine it, a 65-horsepower engine buzzing like a mosquito, diving toward tanks that could swat it from the sky with one burst of their machine guns. He released his first volley. 6 streaks of white smoke tore downward, the roar of bazookas echoing through the valley. Seconds later, one tank erupted in orange fire. Another ground to a halt, black smoke billowing from its hatch. The Germans couldn't believe what they were seeing. A tiny American spotter plane, the kind usually ignored or swatted down by rifle fire, was attacking them head-on. Panicked gunners spun their turrets, firing at the sky. Machine gun tracers laced through the air, inches from Carpenter's wings. He yanked the stick, the Cub jerked upward, barely clearing the tree line. Back at base, his fellow pilots were sure he wouldn't return. Then, 10 minutes later, that familiar buzz echoed over the field. Rosie glided in, smoke-streaked and trembling, but still flying. When Carpenter climbed out, his mechanics stared at him in disbelief. He was grinning. "Boys," he said, "I think I just scared the hell out of some Germans." That day alone, he was credited with destroying or disabling 2 German tanks and several vehicles. The legend of Bazooka Charlie began to spread through the 4th, armored like wildfire. Infantrymen who once laughed now pointed upward during firefights, shouting, "There goes the mad major." And word began to reach the enemy too. German soldiers started calling the little American Cubs flying devils, because once you saw one diving, it was already too late. After Arracourt, Carpenter was no longer just an oddball pilot, he was a phenomenon. Newspaper reporters picked up the story almost instantly. The idea that a high school teacher in a paper-thin plane had destroyed German tanks was too wild to ignore. Headlines blazed across the Allied world. The mad major who hunts tanks from the sky. The schoolteacher who turned his Cub into a killer. But beneath the sensational headlines, there was something more important: proof. Battlefield reports credited him with destroying or disabling 6 German tanks, including at least 1 Panther and 2 Tiger Is, the most feared machines of the war. To put that into perspective, a Tiger's armor was up to 4 inches thick on the front, nearly impenetrable to anything short of a high-velocity cannon. But Carpenter knew something others didn't. He understood angle. He studied history, geometry, and physics, and he realized the top of a tank was its weakest spot. The thin steel covering the turret and engine deck was often less than an inch thick. A bazooka rocket, carrying a shaped charge warhead, could punch through it if it hit at just the right angle. That's why he always dove steeply, nearly vertical, timing his rockets to hit from above. It was dangerous, borderline suicidal, but it worked, and each success pushed him to go further. He'd swoop down so low that his wheels almost brushed the treetops, loosing all 6 rockets in a single pass before pulling up in a screaming climb. Ground troops later swore they could hear him laughing over the roar of his engine. Soon, his Piper Cub wasn't just a curiosity, it was feared. German tank crews began ordering their men to fire on any low-flying aircraft, no matter how small. His comrades loved him for it. To them, Carpenter was living proof that courage could be louder than horsepower. But success had a price. Each time he landed, his mechanics found new bullet holes in Rosie's wings. Once, a burst of machine gun fire shredded his elevator control cable. He barely made it back, landing in a French field with his rudder jammed and smoke pouring from the engine. Yet each time, he patched up the Cub and went back out. When someone asked why he kept taking such insane risks, he answered simply, "When I see those boys down there fighting with everything they've got, how can I do any less?" He began receiving medals, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Air Medal with oak leaf clusters. But Carpenter never cared much for the attention. He kept a photo of his students taped inside the cockpit, a reminder of who he was before the madness. To him, each flight wasn't about glory. It was about protecting the men on the ground, the same kind of young men he might have once taught in class. And as he became a legend, one thing became clear. Even in war, imagination could be deadlier than steel. By the winter of 1944, the legend of Bazooka Charlie had spread far beyond his division. Men at the front told stories about a tiny plane that appeared out of nowhere, spat fire, and vanished into the clouds before anyone could aim. But behind those tales of daring was a truth only Carpenter himself understood. Every flight was a gamble with death. The Piper L4 Grasshopper wasn't designed for war. Its wings were fabric stretched over metal tubing. Its cockpit was unarmored glass. Its engine, the size of a lawnmower motor, could barely outpace a jeep on the ground. One burst of machine gun fire, even a lucky rifle shot, could turn it into a coffin with wings. Carpenter knew this. But he also knew something else. Fear is only useful until it stops you from doing your job. He flew low, sometimes at treetop height, using the terrain to mask his approach. When he spotted a tank column, he'd cut power to glide silently above them, then dive almost vertically, unleashing all 6 rockets before the enemy realized he was there. His attacks lasted seconds, his margin for survival even less. Fellow pilots called him crazy. Commanders worried he'd encourage copycats who'd get themselves killed. But Carpenter shrugged it all off. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he was just doing what made sense. If you can see the enemy, and you've got the tools to stop him, he once told a correspondent, why wouldn't you? Still, the toll was obvious. The Cub came back riddled with holes, the wings patched with duct tape and cloth. He flew with sandbags under his seat to balance the weight of the bazookas. Each takeoff was a prayer, each landing a miracle. During one mission near the Moselle River, German troops spotted him early. He dived through small arms fire so dense it looked like rain. Bullets tore through his tail and wing struts, one grazing his left arm. Yet he managed to hit a Tiger tank, a direct strike that set it ablaze. He limped home with the cub shaking violently, the engine coughing smoke. When he landed, medics ran out. Carpenter waved them off. He climbed out, bleeding, smiling, and said, "Rosie took a few hits, but she bites hard." By then, even the brass had stopped trying to rein him in. General Patton himself supposedly remarked that he wished he had 100 more like Carpenter. And yet, the madness wasn't just in the flying, it was in the burden. Because for every tank he destroyed, Carpenter also saw the faces of the men below, both Allied and German victims of his invention. He was a teacher at heart, not a killer. But war had turned him into something in between, a man who taught the world that imagination could kill just as effectively as steel. He often wrote in his letters home that the real war wasn't between nations, but between courage and fear, and that every time he climbed to Rosie, he fought both. And as the months wore on, those battles inside him grew louder than the ones in the skies. When the guns finally went silent in Europe, Carpenter's war was far from over, though not in the way anyone expected. He had survived dozens of missions that should have killed him a dozen times over. His little plane, Rosie the Rocketer, had become a legend in itself, patched, scarred, its yellow skin riddled with bullet holes. Men who'd fought alongside him said the plane looked like a piece of Swiss cheese with wings. But to them, Rosie was sacred, a symbol of the impossible. In late 1945, Carpenter was promoted to Major, awarded the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Air Medal with oak leaf clusters. But he didn't celebrate much. He was tired. He'd seen enough smoke, fire, and wreckage for a lifetime. When people called him a hero, he would shake his head and say softly, "I just wanted to make my history class more interesting." He returned to Urbana, Illinois, to the quiet rhythm of teaching. The same man who once dove on tanks from the clouds now taught teenagers about ancient wars, the fall of Rome, and the lessons of courage. But war never really lets go. The army called him back to active duty in the late 40s this time, not for combat, but for training and advisory work. His students had changed, the world had changed. Yet in every classroom, when he spoke of history, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd lived it. Then, in 1949, tragedy struck. Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a form of cancer that, back then, offered little hope. He continued teaching as long as his strength allowed, insisting that courage wasn't something reserved for the battlefield. He passed away in 1966, at just 53 years old. By then, the world had nearly forgotten his story. To most, the war was a distant memory, fading behind newer headlines and newer heroes. But Rosie the Rocketer wasn't done. For decades, her whereabouts were unknown. Then, in the 21st century, historians and aviation enthusiasts began searching. Piece by piece, they uncovered records, photos, and serial numbers until one day, Rosie was found, restored, and displayed again in her wartime glory. Her olive-drab wings gleam under museum lights now, her 6 bazookas faithfully reattached, a reminder of one man's wild courage. Visitors stand beneath her and marvel, not because she's big or powerful, but because she represents something profoundly human. She is proof that in the middle of the world's most mechanized war, one man's imagination could still change everything. Carpenter's daughter, Carol Apaki, once said that her father was misunderstood, that his story was never about killing tanks, but about refusing to be helpless. And that's what makes him unforgettable. Because for all his daring, Bazooka Charlie Carpenter was still a teacher, showing the world that courage isn't about the size of your weapon, it's about the size of your idea. In every war, there are men who follow orders and a few who rewrite them. Major Charles Carpenter was one of the latter. He took a civilian plane, a handful of bazookas, and a classroom's worth of ingenuity, and built a legend that defied both logic and fear. He proved that victory isn't always about firepower or technology. Sometimes it's about the stubborn belief that one person can still make a difference. When asked what drove him, Carpenter once replied, "You can't just sit there and watch history happen. You have to get in and fly it." Today, his story lives on, not as a tale of madness, but of brilliance born from desperation. And every time the world faces impossible odds, the spirit of that little piper cub, diving through smoke and flak, reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war is imagination.